This week on Solitary, Poor, Nasty, Brutish, and Short, Scott sits down with Dr. Marie Kawthar Daouda, a French literature scholar and lecturer at Oriel College. They discuss the romantic, the absurd, COVID, and the scapegoat, focusing on Girard and Camus, among others. Happy listening!
Marie, thank you so much for coming onto the show.
Thank you for having me, Scott.
My first question is about your article, Saints Under an Empty Sky, which I confess I read this afternoon. And, this is kind of a selfish question insofar as that my research here looks at COVID-19 and the associated public health response in New York and the sort of broader implications for American society. I'm specifically looking at legitimacy fractures and fractures in public trust, which were brought to the forefront of public discourse during and after COVID-19. So it seems all the more relevant to ask about Camus' 1947 novel La Peste now. Having read this article about tenderness and sort of what Camus was, diagnosing or maybe normatively getting at in the book. My question just broadly to you is how the novel may shed light on the experience of the pandemic, which most of us just lived through.
Well, a fun fact about this novel is that it was virtually impossible to lay one's hands on it during the time of the pandemic because the demands were so high. I think everyone went on a reading La Peste spree at that time. So yes, it seemed quite topical at that time, well, first because of the title and also because of the rather dramatic discourse that we had. Things were still extremely uncertain and then things increasing, as you know, towards March and then the lockdowns. So I suppose there was a sort of almost apocalyptic feeling in the atmosphere, and people, I suppose, wanted to turn to literature to have a sense of how other periods have dealt with similar concepts, similar themes. So in Camus' La Peste, it is a plague that is brought in by rats. It all begins with the discovery of a rat that looks like it had died of strange circumstances, and then all of a sudden more rat corpses appear, and then the plague spreads to humans. It quickly becomes uncontrollable, and the characters that are at the forefront are a priest and a doctor. And I think this tension between the idea of medical healing and spiritual healing is also something that we felt very strongly at that time. In the immediate context of the publication, 1947, many people wanted to read La Peste as a disclosure of the mental and intellectual plague of fascism and National Socialism at that time. And that was the reading that Sartre offered, contrasting Camus' insights with the sort of the madness of the crowds that would have swept through Europe in the 30s. And there's a play by Eugène Ionesco, Rhinocéros, that also has this theme of contagion linked to fascism. Rhinocéros. So people gradually turn into rhinoceroses. How do you say that? Rhinoceroses, right. So that play also has this idea of, contagion by imitating ideas, etc. However, as soon as Sartre gave that reading of the novel, Camus protested and said that it would be extremely reductive to see it just as a sort of denunciation of mental plagues or the way intellectual contagion can spread one idea from a person to another. And Camus, through that novel, I think, was mainly grappling with the problem of evil. So rather than seeing the plague as a medical issue, it was much more, this question of the evil that appears and that is so far beyond the evil that men do, but that also is linked to the ethical choices that people make at that time. So what is very moving about that novel is that we have people from very different intellectual, spiritual backgrounds grappling with the same problem. What decisions do they make in that context? And one of the most moving scenes of that passage is when a child is dying of the plague. So in that hospital, there is just that scream of the child, and that seems to be gathering the pain of the entire humanity. So it is far more than just talking about immediate historical context or response to health issues. It is really about the fact that there are things that cannot be controlled and that put us face to face with some rather dark things, with just the human condition. And in a way, instead of providing us with a form of heroic answer, Camus brings things down to a very intimate, very humane approach, that the way to answer to that is to love the ones that are around us. So both the priest and the doctor have this temptation to solve problems at a sort of massive scale. And they both fail, but they fail beautifully because they tried all they could. And eventually the moment of peace and reconciliation that happens is that towards the end of the plague, while people hover between despair and disappointment that nothing really worked, there's that scene where they're swimming in the sea. So you have this openness in comparison with the stifling, closed environment of cities being under lockdown. They're in the sea, they're swimming, and there is freedom and reconnecting with one another as human beings. So it's probably one of Camus' hardest novels to interpret from a political and ethical point of view, because its entire perspective is towards the human and the metaphysical. So Camus' existentialism is often limited to the absurd, as the world, nothing has any meaning, etc. But that's largely, I suppose, deriving it from l'homme révolté, so the idea that the meaning of life is in opposition, because everything is absurd anyway, so the only thing that we can do is fight against. But in La Peste, there is a much deeper idea of fighting for something, so fighting against the plague that might be creeping into our heart and making us reject any possibility of beauty or connection with the other. So I think, in a way, one of the reasons why this novel called on to so many readers at that time was that we were trying to make meaning of an experience that seemed sudden, absurd, revolting on many levels, that, well, from one day to the other, liberties were removed for reasons of general public safety, and people were just wanting to make sense of that all. And I suppose this answer precisely, Camus' answer precisely in its openness and ambiguities that derive from the narrative form is something that could have brought solace to many people at that time.
The scene of swimming in the sea, does that come towards the end?
Yes, I think it's 3/4 in, or towards the very end.
Okay. I confess I've not read La Peste. I think I had an examination on some passages of it when I was in high school, but that was many moons ago.
Well, having read passages of it is already quite good.
I just remember that one, the famous quote, "The only way to fight the plague is with decency."
Yes, exactly. And I think that summarizes it rather well. It's something that Sartre rather opposed. So in Sartre's typology of people, there is la belle âme, the beautiful soul, and it's the person who just tries to be decent no matter what. And for Sartre, well, the ideal character is le salaud, so the scallywag, so
Yeah.
someone who would just make the practical decisions right then, and who wouldn't refuse to do evil if some hypothetical good might come of it. And Camus really resented this position, especially in the aftermath of the resistance, when everyone claimed resistance credentials and wanted to look like they had been doing the right thing at the right time, and while in fact many people had been taking the sort of pragmatic decisions that seemed the most expedient, but not necessarily the most decent.
Mm. And I've many things to follow up on here, few of which were planned previously. So I like to riff off of this. First, I should say I had a very short-lived life. in French theater. Me and a small group of others performed Huis Clos.
Oh, right.
Yeah,
Oh, good luck with that.
back in the day. It brings the South back for me. Um, but I wanna hone in on a few things. So there's the swimming in the sea scene reminds me of the end of Illusion Perdue.
Yes.
At the end, when Lucien returns to the sea,
Mm.
I sort of read that as a return to nature, return to your, not in a Rousseau sense, but in a sense of being stripped bare of the illusions of grand life in the city and moral decay and such. He returns to where is he from?
But originally he's from Angoulême.
Angoulême.
Yes.
Yeah. But at the last scene in the lake, I think, is
Yes,
back at
it's
Angoulême.
yes, it's the lack, not the sea, but you're right. There's
Yeah.
this idea of openness and nature, and
Not
that, but
salinated
from
water. Yeah.
not from a Rousseau perspective. Indeed, I think Balzac was rather opposed to Rousseau, mainly because Balzac believed in original sin, and Rousseau did not. I think a lot of the articulations of Balzac's narratives are around the idea of the well, the fallenness of mankind and how rare it is to have some redeeming moments. So he's usually labeled as a realist, but there is quite a lot of spiritual and at times theological depth in the way he writes. And the sad thing with Illusion Perdue is not just that the illusions are lost, it's that
No, it's not a sad thing. I think that's a good thing.
Yes. But after that, you have Splendeurs et Misères des Courtisanes. Have you ever looked into that one?
No.
So it's the sequel. It's just about as long or slightly longer. And you see that.
What's the name of the editor, the big portly guy who runs he's a recurring character in Balzac.
Not Daniel, David Séchard. I should know that.
He's like, he runs the literary mafia in Paris.
Yes. Oh, his name escapes me.
Anyway,
I must confess that I should read more Balzac. I've been told that quite recently. But yes, no, I can't think of who he is, but he's definitely in Illusion Perdue and a few others.
You were talking about the sequel.
Yes. So on the sequel of Illusion Perdue, the idea is, well, not only are the illusions lost, but the whole trope of the romantic character redeemed by his love, etc., is completely broken down, because you have that dark and yet wonderful character, Vautrin, who has a complete hold on Lucien, sleeping to its
He wins in the end.
I'm sorry?
He sort of wins.
Yes, but he's a sort of almost supernatural force of evil in that cycle where you have...
What is winning?
Yes. Well, Le Père Goriot, Illusion Perdue, Splendeurs et Misères des Courtisanes is a beautiful unfolding of how a character who is almost supernaturally evil could lead the reader to a form of sympathy and understanding. It's quite strange, because he's probably the best love-hate character that Balzac ever created, because he embodies this sort of rebellion against society. So he's very well aware of all the things that do not work well, and he makes them work for him and for the people he uses. So first he uses Lucien de Rubempré, and he wants to use Lucien's romantic interest, Esther, who is one of the most beautiful figures of a penitent prostitute that ever happened in literature. So he uses people, he destroys them. In the end, he is destroyed himself, but there is something so superhuman about it that it forces admiration at the same time as repulsion.
I want to return to this image of sort of swimming. I know one is in the sea, one is in the lake. I think, yeah, I mean, is there a comparison to be made between this scene of, the world is falling apart, Rome is burning, but we'll swim in the sea with each other and have camaraderie, and Lucien like returning to nature? And then, I mean, it almost has me thinking of sort of Buddhist or Hindu notions of the your soul being like a drop of water returning to the sea
Mm-hmm.
of the universe, like your Atman returning
Yes.
to the ocean
Yes.
of being. Um, I don't know. These are the three images. Maybe I don't have a theory or anything, but
Yes. Well,
this comes to mind.
it's interesting to bring that one, especially for the points of, well, let's say, comparison between Christianity and Buddhism. So Balzac writes as a Christian writer, Camus writes in tension with Christianity. In their context, water has this idea of baptism. So either crossing the Red Sea or being immersed in water, there's an idea of dying and being born again. And what would make that rather different from the Hindu idea of dissolving into the greatness of being is that the individuality is kept. It's really the self that remains, and that self that dies and is born again. So the end game is not the dissolution, it is the recovery of the initial self. And while we have that in La Peste, we don't have much of it in Balzac because of his view of, well, a sort of inherent fallenness, that things cannot be solved just through a sort of a magical Rousseauian return to nature, return to the source, and then you're all made new and clean again. For Balzac, it takes a much deeper process, and it's quite fascinating because some academics have seen that as the core of La Comédie Humaine, so Balzac's great cycle, that it's not just about giving us a fresco of French society in that time, but it's also about showing how the suffering of some characters can cause the salvation or redemption of other characters. And it's what Balzac develops as a literary adaptation of the Communion of Saints, the fact that what evil one suffers when one is innocent profits to the good to another and can even bring a bad character to
I'm sorry.
redemption.
Say that one more time. The last sentence.
The idea of Communion of Saints.
That what evil wants
Wh-
from an innocent.
Well, the evil that the innocent character suffers can bring the salvation of an evil character. So it's a cycle in which persecuted innocence has a meaning. So it's not an absurd setting that pain is just gratuitous and we don't know why pain happens. It's just part of the human condition. For Balzac, the suffering of the innocent is meant to bring the salvation of the guilty. And in that, he's inspired by Joseph de Maistre, so sort of anti-revolutionary, late counter-revolutionary author who, well, he's not French, he's originally from, what would be considered, well, modernly somewhere between Switzerland and Italy. He went in exile in Russia when the Napoleonic troops invaded that region. So he went there, well, as a Savoyard exile, spent quite a lot of time with Russian nobility, discussing matters of Catholicism, Orthodoxy, and all of that. And in one of his most famous works, Soirée de Saint-Pétersbourg, there's a whole section about this communion of saints, so the reversibility of merits and pains. So the suffering of the innocent brings the salvation of the guilty. And Balzac was a huge fan of Joseph de Maistre. So there's a direct connection between that and the way Balzac displays evil in La Comédie Humaine.
I mean, this sounds like a flood. This is the original Catholic narrative. The suffering of the innocent brings the salvation of the guilty.
Yes.
Well, I suppose. But does it bring the salvation of the guilty because they then can see this cruel, evil act played out in front of them, and then they can see how they have. Well, one would hope that they could see how they have behaved similarly or enacted similar punishments on other innocents. Is that the idea?
In some novels, it's very explicit. It's actually even more explicit in some of Balzac's shortest novels that could almost be categorized nowadays as young adult fiction. So Ursule Mirouet is a novel that Balzac wrote for a 14-year-old young lady, and it is the story of a persecuted, innocent, absolutely delightful young woman who is, well, who undergoes so many challenges because the people around her want to steal her fortune that she should have inherited.
Right.
So everyone conspires against her. So she's the perfect innocent victim. And in the end of the novel, the character that the reader got to hate the most because of how evil he'd been is redeemed through realizing what Ursule, this young woman, had gone through, and he considers her as a sort of secular saint. So he almost worships her because he realizes how bad he had been to her and how good she had been in response. So sometimes Balzac is very explicit about it. Sometimes it is left to the reader to see how the different narratives that intertwine from one volume to another show that no evil is left meaningless. If a character suffers, there is someone within the same narrative arc that is going to be redeemed in a way or another. So sometimes it's a very material redemption, so sort of a happy ending. There aren't that many happy endings in La Comédie Humaine, but there are a few, and sometimes they come from that sacrifice. Sometimes, well, characters who were meant to be good end up just going all downhill, like Rastignac. He's a sort of counterpart to Lucien de Rubempré. Lucien de Rubempré is a sort of failed romantic hero. Rastignac is a failed romantic hero too because he goes to Paris. He goes with all his ideals, illusions, etc., and then succeeds through the way he manages his relationships with women.
Sure,
So
like Georges Duroy or
exactly,
yeah.
yes. So, and Georges Duroy, well, the Maupassant version of that same character happens much later, and it's even more cynical with the way
Well, that
Maupassant
was
shows it.
just, that was is funny, but also
Yes,
crazy.
yes, and it turns out just fine for Georges Duroy. And as readers, we don't know if we should be happy because it ends well with the protagonist, or feeling outraged because this is not what we had signed in for. If you consider that the basic Aristotelian narrative in terms of virtue is a story where evil is punished and virtue is rewarded, the 19th century is probably one of the periods where there is the most tension between that, because there are still these ideas of virtue and vice. The problem is that once these ideas are too challenged, too deconstructed, it's very hard to have potent characters like that that would engage you at an ethical level as well as the aesthetic level.
Yeah, I have a whole question about in the 19th century and Romanticism, but I'm not going to ask you that now against my strong inclination to do so, because I want to ask you some other questions. Have you ever come across, he's French, but he writes, I don't know that he's written in French. He writes, or at least everything is first written in English. Nassim Taleb. He's not a literary person by any stretch of the imagination. Well, he maybe is, but he wrote a book called The Black Swan,
Yes,
Anti-Fragile.
the name is familiar, but I've never read
Yeah.
anything by him.
Very much outside of the
Yes.
canon that we're talking
Yes.
about here. I'm reading now the Black Swan.
Right.
I think the full title is The Black Swan, The Impact of the Highly Improbable.
Right.
And he talks
Great
about,
title.
yeah,
Yeah.
the writing is brilliant. It's very fun. It's tongue in cheek. It
Right.
pokes fun at academia.
Yes,
Uh,
sounds good.
Yes. He's dropped in and out of academia. He's extremely well read. He's one of these polymaths. He was a quantitative hedge fund trader for a while. But so he writes this book, which I've just begun reading a few days ago. And he's talking mainly in the book about how all forecasting is, well, it's not just wrong, it's fruitless and silly, and that you can't really possibly pretend to have any idea what's coming around the
I
corner.
can see how he'd have derived that from hedge fund management.
He made a lot of money on this, whereas there's a huge. I worked in finance. There's a huge drive. You have to send out shareholder letters every quarter. You have to. The idea is, what is your outlook on the markets? You have to have an outlook on what's going to happen to predict the future, to shoot where it's going to be, not where it is. And his thing was building portfolios which were anti-fragile, which accounted for these extremely unlikely events, whether that's 9/11 or COVID, or he goes through a litany of examples. Anyway, and he emphasizes quite emphatically. He emphasizes emphatically. There's that I could have thought of a better way of phrasing that. Yeah,
It's very
maybe we'll cut that. Yeah, it's very emphatic. He emphasizes repeatedly that the sea of information which we don't know is vastly greater than that which we do.
Of course.
But it reminds me of absurdism, because in there's also, I mean, to come back to not quite French literature, almost. There's a guy at Sciences Po named Oriel College. He wrote a book called, it was first published in French, but I don't remember the French title. It's called Selling the Future, The Perils of Predicting Global Politics,
Right.
something, which again was sort of saying, don't try to predict, you'll be wrong. It is a kind of almost absurdist outlook. His antidote is to be anti-fragile, to, don't worry about the hurricane because it's going to come whether you like it or not, and it's not often going to take the form that you think it will take. But from my very poor armchair description here, does this remind you of absurdism at all?
Well, in a certain sense, the problem is that absurdism, insofar as Camus would be considered its key figure, etc., it's not enough to encompass his entire philosophy. UNESCO is probably a better systematic example of absurdism. Samuel Beckett, has quite a lot of absurd going on too, but it's one of these difficult concepts where, are we talking about just the fact that nothing has any meaning at all, which is already a bold statement in terms of, ascribing meaninglessness as a form of meaning, or are we talking about the pointlessness, which is already something quite different? You could do something that doesn't have an end, but it is meaningful to you, so that would be already quite a different perspective. So when it comes to linking absurdism with the difficulty of predicting the future or being certain about patterns, there are a lot of similarities here, but I'm not sure it would work if we looked back at the authors that we consider as the template sources of absurdism. I'm not quite sure that's what they would.
Who would be?
Towards.
Who would be those authors?
Camus, UNESCO, Beckett as exemplars of what we consider as absurdism in literature. But trying to think of what it would be, I wonder if it's not much more, trying to think of the key standards of Greek philosophy. I wonder if this idea of the difficulty of predicting anything wouldn't lead back to a sort of Stoic approach. You were talking about not worrying about the hurricane because it's coming anyway, and therefore you just deal with it once it comes, but deal with what you can while you can. I think there's a much more Stoic approach than absurd approach. You still have to deal with things, but you have to deal with the ones that you can control. And I suppose here it would harken a lot more towards Seneca than Camus.
Was Camus engaging with or drawing upon Nietzsche?
And nature, what do you mean by nature?
Upon, not nature, Nietzsche.
Nietzsche, oh, right. Not that I know of, but I should look more into that.
I don't know either, but it did seem interesting. Okay, and then very lastly on the first question, and then I will move on and move down the clipboard. This isn't a question, it's an observation. You mentioned the scene of the child screaming in the hospital, which is so evocative and really encapsulates the pain that this community is feeling. I wrote my thesis at Princeton on literary journalism in the latter half of the 20th century. So I was focused on Joan Didion, George Plimpton, and Hunter Thompson. And Joan Didion, I think it's in Slouching Towards Bethlehem, but it might be in the White Album. I think it's in Slouching Towards Bethlehem. She has an essay on Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco, which is like sort of hippie central. And she describes this household she's entered, where she sees a child chewing on LSD, like a high infant, and like that's the scene. She just describes this child is tripping on LSD, and whether by accident or on purpose or whatever. Very evocative, very evocative, like the child in the hospital.
Yes. Well, I suppose one of the things that is extremely hard to deal with in real life and that literature somehow tries to grapple with is, well, that we see childhood as innocence, not so much as the wish not to do evil, but being in that powerless situation of the child that doesn't have the strength or the will to inflict any pain. It's the difficulty when we see children suffering is that it's very hard to have the sort of a adult worldview that, oh well, they're going to make some meaning of it, or maybe they deserved it, or it is complicated. Seeing a child in pain, well, you'd never say, well, it's complicated, maybe the child deserved it in a way or another, right? And I think one of the difficulties in that is that we have somehow lost two views that used to be more prevalent, I'd say, a sort of a more religious atmosphere. One is the concept of original sin that Isaac uses quite a lot, the idea that no one is innocent inherently, that there are complex ramifications to original sin that might mean that to a human eye, the suffering of the child might be absurd and meaningless, etc. But to, well, from the perspective of eternity, that too has some sort of meaning. So there's this one, which is never enough to console a parent who's just lost a child. You would never tell, well, it's okay, it will make sense in the time when you'll see why this happened because of original sin. That really doesn't make sense. And the other attitude that we've lost is the one that, well, the Christian answer to original sin, which is the communion of saints, that we might not see that there's a meaning to that, but the communion of saints, well, which is considered as the body of Christ, makes sense of it for us in a way, because Christ has already suffered all of that for us. So it might seem absurd, scandalous, etc., if you take the raw perspective that, well, this is going on because of original sin. But if you consider the faith in a God that has died on the cross, that too can make sense. And, well, dealing with patterns of grief and disappointment, this is an idea that brings solace to many people of faith when they go through dreadful experiences like losing a child or losing a friend, with, well, absolutely no rational explanation that could be provided.
There's a lot to digest there. I'm just
sorry.
I'm digesting. No, don't apologize. Okay, I wanna just ask. I wanna wrap up on Saints Under an Empty Sky and ask about other relevant literary examples which come to mind. You know, whether about the plague or not, whether francophone or not. I mean, personally, one that comes to mind about scapegoating is Les Animaux Malades de la Peste, and this poor donkey who, you know, dies for the sins of all the other animals. I think during COVID it became quite a politicized issue, and between left and right in the US, and both sides sort of wanted scalps, and there were scalps produced on both sides. But and we could get into Girardian scapegoating. But this is just purely like a listicle question, so that I can go and read these books later for my own selfish benefit. The books that that's not a book. That's I suppose it's a poem. It's in the collected. What is Les Animaux Malades de la Peste appeared?
It's a fable by Jean de La Fontaine,
Yeah,
the 17th century.
right. It was a collection of fables.
Yes, exactly. I think it's in book 3, but I'm not sure.
Yeah,
Quote me on that.
that
Yes.
sounds about right. And then I don't know what Love in the Time of Cholera comes to mind from Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Edgar Allan Poe has this poem, The Red Death.
Yes.
But what else? Give me some other
You want more
examples.
plague stories?
Yeah,
Is
more
that-
more plague stories or metaphors for plague, or examples of times when, from, well, any literature, French, English, whatever, where a community, some plague, whether a pathogen caused plague or being cursed for whatever, comes to the community, and the community sort of descends into chaos and finds a solution to it. And I feel you're maybe a good person to ask.
Aside from the ones that you've already listed and that are absolutely great, there is Cardinal Newman's Callista, where there is a plague that is brought by locusts. So the locusts fly through a rather prosperous, fertile part of North Africa. They all die as they go. So the propagation of plague through locusts is that their corpses are extremely pathogen, and then from the corpse there is the plague spreads from the dead locusts to the animals, then to the humans. So it's a sort of uncontrollable spree of destruction from the insects that eat all the crops to the animals gradually dying because of that. So the scene, the description of the invasion of locusts is absolutely wonderful in John Henry Newman's Callista. There is also, off the top of my mind, there is by Marcel Schwab. There's a story of La Mort Rouge, if I remember well. It's a short story.
The Red Death.
Le Masque de la Mort Rouge. Yes, the
Mask
of the Red Death.
That's Edgar Allan Poe.
Sorry, no. It's so Marcel Schwab wrote it's Le Roi au Masque d'Or. Yes, another mask story. And Marcel Schwab was a reader of Edgar Allan Poe, so not the
what Mask of Gold?
The Le Roi au Masque d'Or, the king with the golden mask.
Yeah.
So it's the story of a king who, he's a leper, and he hides his leprosy under a golden mask. And it's a strange story of mercy that he would end up being rescued by someone. But I won't tell you more about that because it's a short story, and it's all in the plot twist. Trying to think of other plague narratives in Marie Corelli's Vendetta. So super niche reference, but she was a bestseller in her time. So Victorian bestseller. This was published. So Vendetta was published, I think, in 1886.
What's the book, sorry?
Vendetta.
Just Vendetta.
Vendetta, yes.
What's it about?
The subtitle is The Story of One Forgotten. So the novel starts when there is a plague of cholera somewhere in Italy. A young man who just married the love of his life dies. He's buried, except that he hadn't really died. So he comes out after, the plague has passed, and he realizes that many changes have happened while he had been wandering around trying to retrieve traces of his past life. And the plague there it's the starting point of the narrative, but it's also an image of the moral corruption that is going on all around. So I'd say, off the top of my head, that these would be the 3 plague narratives that I would add to your list.
What about non-pathogen plagues? I don't know.
What examples do you have in mind for non-pathogen plagues?
You
mean just things that propagate from one person to another?
Bad ideas
for one. There is
ideas that society, like everyone collectively takes on.
Very recently, Lionel Shriver's Mania. I think it's a great example of plague and counter-plague. I don't know if you've read it.
No. It's fiction?
It's fiction. It's dystopian. It's about a world where it has become impossible to call anyone idiot. So discrimination on the basis of intelligence is now
This is
forbidden.
yeah.
Well, the book was published, I think, in 2017, but I think we've
Okay.
seen a lot of that going on. So the interesting aspect about that is the imitation effect, that people might not be convinced that it is the right thing to do, but they would do it because peer pressure, social pressure,
Sure.
wanting to be kind,
Yeah.
all of these things that lead people to make choices just because the people around them have made the same decision. So is it really a choice, or is it not? Is it? Well, I think the title of the book says it all. It's a mania, it's sort of spree of madness that takes the whole society. But there's an interesting, plot twist towards the end that shows that even the correction to that can take the pattern of social imitation, and that we're so gregarious that even when trying to make things hard, to make things right again, it's also by imitation, by contagion.
So such a nice segue. We're talking about imitation, and the next set of questions is about
Transition.
Girard. So for the unacquainted, could you walk us through, the basics of mimetic theory and the scapegoat mechanism, and then the way out? Let's start with mimetic theory, just for the
It's a great place to
for the
start
unacquainted.
because nowadays René Girard is known much more as an anthropologist, but he started off as a literature academic, doing comparative literature, working mainly on narratives where imitation had a key role. So his foundational work, Mensonges romantiques et vérités romanesques, is about the fact that after the sort of romantic turn of the 19th century, we have considered it normal that a hero would be an absolutely original individual. While if we take a closer look at the literature of the period, heroes are not original, they're imitators. So if you take, for instance, the main 19th century novel that Girard works on, it's Stendhal's Le Rouge et le Noir.
Yeah.
So Julien Sorel there is presented as this character who wants to be unique, but of course his desires are imitated. So the way Girard deals with that is looking back at Quixote, so Cervantes' it's considered the last epic because it makes fun of the epic story itself, and Quixote wants to be like Amadis de Gaul, so the last knight. So in a way you have the last Hidalgo imitating the last knight. It's a story of the end of the narrative in a way. And what Girard says is that Quixote is honest about the fact that he imitates.
Yeah.
While Julien Sorel would imitate knowing that he imitates, but with this permanent wish to be original. So Julien Sorel would have wanted to be Napoleon. It doesn't work quite well. And he is, in a way, trapped in his wish to be original, while his love story with Madame de Rênal is because in the books, what a young man of his age should do is to have that relationship with that married woman of the aristocracy, etc. So that's just ticking the boxes of any romantic story, right? And then he does the same thing with Mathilde de la Mole, and Mathilde is herself an imitating character. So she wants to do what her ancestors would do, and without any spoiler, the last scene where Mathilde appears is all about her fulfilling her wish to be exactly like her ancestors. So for Girard, there would be a difference between stories like Cervantes' Quixote, where imitation is clearly displayed and made fun of, and Le Rouge et le Noir, where the reader is embezzled towards believing that the character is the source of his own desire. And Girard takes that a bit further, looking at Madame Bovary by Gustave Flaubert, showing us that Emma too is obsessed with being original, living a special life, but she keeps borrowing her desires from the books she reads first when she's still in the convent school, Then she imitates her desires from the newspapers she reads. Then she imitates her desires from the people she aspires to be. So sort of circle of lost nobility. And for Girard, the illusion that we have today is that we believe that our desires are what makes us original. So you are the sum of your desires as an individual, and we overlook the fact that each of these desires has an origin and that we can trace them to our models. So for Girard, the solution to that is to acknowledge our models, and he moves from this literary background to the anthropological background with the idea of scapegoating.
But let's say mimetic theory for a second.
Yes,
I
sure.
think it's.
Well, we can cycle back to that. I can.
Oh yeah, but
Let's add a
okay,
bit
go ahead.
more.
Go ahead.
So, when he says that we should acknowledge our models, he gives a model for that, and he has an interesting personal conversion story. Anyway, he starts by studying that in books. Then he realizes that, hey, we do have a story where someone says, imitate me because I'm imitating someone else, and that's his reading of the Gospels. So for him, the Gospels disclose first the truth about the fact that desires are imitated by showing us the person of Jesus saying, imitate me like I imitate the Father, and then St. Paul saying, imitate me like I imitate Jesus. So it's a sort of long string of people who acknowledge who they're imitating instead of seeing, look at how original I am, look at how special I am. And if we look today, at the concept of influencers, for instance, these are people who claim to be original. They generate content that people would not only imitate in their real life, but spread virally online. So it's as though their self was duplicated endlessly in however many screens have that on display or have that on their timeline. So I think Girard would have, he's quite a key figure to understand our modern tension between wanting to be original and being trapped in imitation. So for Girard, we cannot escape imitation. It's the basis of our survival as human beings, but we can acknowledge that we do have these models and that everything about mankind is mimetic.
And the scapegoat. Back.
And the scapegoating. So it's one of the transitions that many people find slightly difficult in Girard, moving from his literary work to his, strictly speaking, anthropological work.
Sure.
The idea for Girard is that since all our desires are imitating, at some point we all end up wanting the same thing, right? If the thing that is singled out as being desirable is, I don't know, I'll take a silly example, the latest iPhone, everyone wants that. It creates a competition around people. They all want the same thing. In a civilized, polite society, we won't go punching everyone on the queue to the Apple store to get the iPhone, but you do see scenes of strange fighting, especially in this Black Friday season, people wanting something so bad that they throw people out of the way to enter a shop or punch people in line to get to the thing that they want. So we are, in fact, still very violent about the things we want, even in our over polite, consumerist society. So for Girard, having this element to desire creates mimetic rivalries. Everyone wants the same thing. So what it creates is micro tensions between all the people who want the same thing, who end up, as they cannot all have it, they end up competing in other things. And that's what Girard calls a climate of mimetic violence. Because if we cannot have this thing, it's not that it will make us friends not to have it. We will end up transposing our tensions on other matters. And therefore, it becomes a sort of fighting of everyone against everyone because no one really has what he wants.
But for what? If it's no longer for
so according to Girard, it could be transposed to absolutely anything. So
let's make up an example.
So suppose, to start from a literary example, two people love the same person. They cannot have her.
Yes.
They end up competing about other things. Let's say their job or their the last thing they bought or whatever.
But one of them can have her.
I'm sorry?
one of them can have her.
Well, if one of them does have her, in a way, the conflict is resolved. And what Girard would say
Is
is
it, or
that
does the one who doesn't successfully court the object of their desire, is he bitter and envious?
well, for Girard, it's what he calls the triangulation of desire. So if two people want the same thing, according to Girard, and that's probably one of the neat things of his literary theory. So let's say A and B love C.
Mm.
If A loves C and B loves C, it's also that B wants to imitate A
Yeah.
loving C by owning C through A. So for Girard, to have is to be. So if the people, well, to go back to the idea of a situation where everyone cannot have the object of desire, what happens is that everyone competes for different things, but the identity is completely blurred. So we both want, I don't know, the glass on the table, we can't reach it. I will think, well, maybe I'll have the plant that is nearer to you instead, because I want to be in your shoes, literally. I would like to be you, so I'd like to have something that is close to you or that you own or whatever. So I can't have your glass of water. I'll try to get your clip notes or something. So it would be a sort of transposing from kids, right? Transposing things from one object of desire to the other, because essentially we want to be someone else than who we are. So that's, for Girard, that's the key problem that we have. And then he links that to the 10 Commandments and how many of them have to do with not wanting something that someone else owns. And he comments on the commandment that goes from not wanting the wife of your neighbor to not wanting your neighbor's donkey. So you shouldn't want anything that belongs to your neighbor, because that's the start of rivalry within a community. But what Girard pinpoints is that if you want your neighbor's wife, it's not because you want the wife, it's because you want to be your neighbor.
Right.
You want to switch identities because the grass is always greener, right? We're always disappointed with who we are. Therefore, we want to be someone else. And that explains characters like Julien Sorel or Madame Bovary, who want the things that are owned by the people they would like to be. So for Julien Sorel, it would be having a mistress who's a member of the nobility, because he himself is not an aristocrat. For, if we take that to more modern settings, we would all want to be influencers. Therefore, we keep retweeting whatever is posted in a sort of, identification with the person who initially did it. So when you give voice to someone else by sharing their content, in a way, you become that person. So it's how Girard shows that our self is codified by who we want to be rather than who we really are. And he sees that as the core problem of violence. And when a society is teeming with this sort of violence, the solution is to catalyze all this anger on someone. So you'd say, oh, well, everything is going wrong here. Maybe it's because of that person. And the person that is singled out is usually someone who is close enough to the community, but sort of an outsider.
Right.
And that's the template for the scapegoat, someone who is within and yet an outsider. So he gives the example of many archetypical myths like Oedipus. So the story of Oedipus, we don't know how it started, but according to Girard, there would have been a historical background to it, where a king would have been murdered in order to stop a plague. So here again, another wonderful plague story. However, Girard says that a myth has been built around the fact that once the king died, the plague stopped. And for him, the story is written a bit backward. So if the plague stopped when the king was killed, it means that the king was somehow guilty. If he was guilty, we have to find something he was guilty of. Hence the story of, well, he must have done something absolutely horrible. What could be worse than killing your father and marrying your mother, right? So Girard argues that the narrative behind scapegoating is always going backwards from the solution of the peace restored once the scapegoat has been killed to ascribing deep guilt to the scapegoat. And that's where he moves from anthropology to Christian anthropology, saying that while many specialists of comparative religion say that Christ is yet another iteration, another example of these stories where someone is killed to restore peace. Well, there is something special, according to Girard, about Christ, because according to the narratives of the gospel, he keeps saying that he is innocent. So while Oedipus is completely engulfed in his guilt and completely assumes his guilt, Christ says, well, I will take up the punishment, but I am saying that I am innocent. So according to Girard, this creates a dramatic cut through which, in societies that have been exposed to Christianity, scapegoatism doesn't happen in the same way. And the reason for that is that we've reached a sort of sacralization of the victim. And we see a lot of that in victimhood narratives today. It's as though we had a never again story around, well, sacrificing an innocent like Christ has been sacrificed. So, of course, scapegoatism does happen, but on the paper, sacrificing the innocent in order to save everyone is something that, well, it has become the greatest Western society taboo.
And yet he does advocate against the scapegoat mechanism.
Oh, of course, because it is based on a lie. Because the idea that killing someone will magically restore peace it doesn't happen for the reasons we think it happens. It happens because there has been an outburst of violence, and therefore everyone can go back to living a more peaceful life. But that's only until the next victim is killed, and so on and so forth.
But without that climax, how do you bring people back down?
Well, according to Girard, it's already too late when you need a scapegoat, so to speak. So if you reach that dimension of mimetic violence, scapegoating will happen, whether you want it or not, and probably not on the people you'd expect.
So it's just like the 7 deadly sins: do not covet. Like, what is the way out of this? The way out of this is a return to Jesus.
Yes, well, according to Girard, there's no other way. So precisely because it allows to...
Who is still a model, by the way.
I'm sorry?
He's still a model. He is still a
Yes,
mediator.
absolutely. But the idea for Girard is that the closer what you want is to you and the other people you want, or the other people who want it, the stronger the tensions will be. But if you set an example that is, well, Jesus is the perfect model because he's entirely God and entirely human. So in a way, we can imitate him, but we can never entirely be him. So you'd never have two people fighting over, but who's more like Jesus or who owns Jesus, because there's this transcendent aspect to him. And also because Jesus himself says, do not imitate me as I imitate the Father. So Jesus points to something that is even higher than himself. So for Girard, the ideal way to avoid a situation of mimetic violence is to have an object that is so distant that no one could actually claim ownership on it, so that the others would not have a sense of jealousy, covetousness. So no one has the totality of Christ, right? It would be but yet everyone can have it, and that's what I think that's why Girard ended up becoming Catholic, because there's something so concrete about the Eucharist and the fact that no one owns Jesus, but everyone can have him.
So how would we apply how might we apply both the descriptive and the normative aspects of this towards contemporary issues? So we'll start with an easy one: academic politics.
Oh, how easy that one is. Which domain in particular are you thinking about?
Professors competing with each other over who publishes, who gets tenure, who can be chair of this little subcommittee.
Right. Well, the paradox about academia is that it's a world where the stakes are very low and the commitment is very high, because who cares in the greater world who is the chair of this faculty or who has published in that journal, right? Yet for academics, it's essential. It's so important. And I suppose one of the reasons for that is that it is, after all, a very small world. And one of the ways to, I don't know, sanitize that through René Girard would probably be through more intellectual humility. There's nothing wrong with someone else being very good at something. And, well, admiring a colleague's work is actually very rewarding. So instead of competing over...
Crazy idea.
Yes, I know, right? Instead of competing over who has done the last big thing, the big article that got published here or there, just, well, giving each other credit and acknowledging one another. And one of the things that is getting gradually lost because of the high numbers of younger academics, etc., is the sense of mentorship and also of debt towards one's professors or whoever got us where we are. When the academic world was much smaller, you could have a clear sense of intellectual lineage and trace, well, this person has been taught by this person, who's been taught by this person. And when you have that string, it's very hard to say, well, that this person is a radically innovative genius. Of course not, because, well, a lot of what this person would have written is derived from their supervisor's work or whatever. So in a way, there was a much stronger acknowledgement of an intellectual filiation, which we're gradually losing now.
Because of numbers?
And I think because of numbers and because of competition. So instead of having, I don't know, 3 supervisees, now a professor would have, well, hundreds at the graduate level. And it becomes a sort of churning thing rather than a direct connection between a sort of master and disciple thing, where then the disciple becomes a master too. So as soon as we want to mass produce academia, we create a space for mimetic rivalries. And instead of having, well, I don't know, a wholesome emulation between the 3 disciples of one master, we have hundreds of students under the same professor who never built this sort of imitative connection with the master and with the sense of acknowledging what they have received. And also, I think it's mainly a problem in the humanities, but it is harming hard sciences as well. The cult of originality in academia, I think, is damaging the intellectual quality of what
The cult of originality?
Yes. So the idea of groundbreaking work.
Yeah.
And you will not have, I don't know, 50 groundbreaking ideas in your life to write 50 groundbreaking articles. But it's the delusion that is nurtured by, well, mass-produced articles. So Publish or Perish, I think it's a great example of teaching us how to recycle ideas that were not that original, but we have to make it look like it's been something quite special, whatever. So instead of emphasizing an idea of tradition and growth, we've emphasized the idea of breaking. So bringing something radically new. And a lot of that is imitated in the humanities from scientific subjects where, in a way, it is possible to have a groundbreaking discovery. You go in your lab and you do something that no one has actually really done before. But even there, many scientifics, well, if you consider the first half of the 20th century, were clearly in a lineage and acknowledged that their research is indebted to that other researcher or scientific who did this or that research, etc. So I suppose the cult of originality always leads to the romantic fallacy that Girard pinpointed, that in a way we are self-made, we have made ourselves out of nothing, rather than acknowledging the amount of inheritance that we all have.
Some of this must come from Romanticism from the 19th century.
A lot of it does come from Romanticism. In fact, well, it comes even earlier. Well, I blame Rousseau, and before him Hobbes. So Rousseau was a reader of Hobbes. I suppose the English-speaking world is a lot more aware of what Rousseau owes to Hobbes, while the French readers believe Rousseau when Rousseau says that he's so special and original, and overlook the fact that a lot of the social contract is a sort of copy-paste from Leviathan.
What do you think were the triumphs and tragedies of, well, first the 18th and then the 19th century? So the triumphs and tragedies of the Enlightenment, and then also of Romanticism. Nice, easy question to be answered in a sentence or two.
Well, the tragedy of the Enlightenment is the French Revolution, of course. Why did we ever do that? And I think the problem in that is that if you look at the first half,
Is that an example of the scapegoat mechanism?
It is absolutely an example of scapegoating, because there was a time when people nurtured the delusion that if the aristocracy was exterminated, then everyone would become equal. But, if you chop off the top of a triangle, it doesn't turn it into a square or rectangle. And the problem is that if you look at the philosophical evolution of the Enlightenment through the 18th century, it moved from a sort of, neo-humanist perspective. If we compare that to the Renaissance humanism, there was a wish to return to centering things on the human individual. So making man the center of everything again, while the 17th century was much more theocentric, either in Britain or in France. And then, so if you look, for instance, at someone like Montesquieu, who also wrote both political essays and fiction, their idea was that, yes, society is full of inequalities, etc. Order is better than chaos. So what we can do is reform the aristocratic system so that more people are represented, so that the repartition of wealth is more fair. By the end of the 18th century, things had matured, largely because of many adjacent political problems. So, for instance, the situation in the United States, I think, had a huge impact on France. All of a sudden, the French had imitative desire towards the United States. Hey, they had a republic. Why can't we?
Yeah.
Well, I think in the United States, if we take into account the fact that...
And they had a republic thanks to France, by the way. Yeah.
It's a sort of strange export of French Enlightenment ideal of equality and British parliamentarism. So there was still an idea that, the state that would be founded, the nation that would be founded, would be a community of people of goodwill who could just talk about political matters and reach polite agreements. If you look at the founding fathers' idea of the United States, it's pretty much, polite London gentlemen discussing politics and believing that they can make a nation from scratch. So, of course, there is a separation from Britain first, and in other states from France. But the main idea was that we're working on a blank slate, while in France the slate was by no means blank. And if you look at, for instance, what Tocqueville writes about l'Ancien Régime et la Révolution, so the French know Tocqueville because of the l'Ancien Régime et la Révolution, while the Americans know Tocqueville for what he saw in America.
Democracy.
Exactly. So Democracy in America. Great book, but it works really well with l'Ancien Régime et la Révolution, because one thing that Tocqueville notes is that no one really understood how the revolution happened. And if you look at the continuity between the Ancien Régime and the revolution, there's a lot more continuity than one would expect after such a massive revolution. So why did a revolution happen if the continuity in the institutions is so strong? And, so the tragedy of the Enlightenment is that it resulted in the beheading of France, the loss of monarchy as the center of institutional stability, while at the same time the other institutions remained. So my guess is that since 1792, France is like a beheaded chicken, just hovering around, whirling, and not going where it's going. And I suppose nowadays that we're talking about a sixth republic, I think it clearly shows that there has been no political stability after the revolution. And Are you asking about a silver lining of the Enlightenment, or?
I'm not necessarily.
Well,
It's open-ended.
I-
That's it. Huh.
well, you asked me for something positive.
I said
Well,
triumphs and tragedy. I mean, that comes from
Right.
Churchill. He wrote triumphs and tragedy,
Yes.
but he was, that's about World War II. He wrote his, 6 volumes on World War II and triumph and tragedy.
Yes.
But I see that the 18th century as having, personally, I see it as having achieved an extraordinary amount for certain political ends, and I see it also as having, I see it as a kind of a Janus face. It failed at the things that it was simultaneously succeeding at in some ways.
Yes. Well, if you compare the outcomes of the revolution in France and in Britain, it's quite striking that in England there has been a revolution, but as soon as it happened, they brought a king back, and in a sense, on the surface, there is stronger continuity. But I have the impression that the institutional changes, especially the balance of power between king and parliament in Britain, has been such that, well, after Charles II, it's never the same in terms of, well, the authority that the king actually has. So when people argued in the 18th century for a British-style constitutional monarchy, and, well, that peaked in 1830 with France switching from an absolute monarchy, the first restoration, to the constitutional monarchy under Louis Philippe.
That was Napoleon's cousin. Right?
Yeah,
It was Napoleon III was one. It was 18. It was
Napoleon III was Napoleon's nephew, and that's 1848. So the strange
okay.
thing is, yes,
Louis Philippe came before.
yes, exactly.
Napoleon III.
So
yeah.
it is very confusing. But so after the French Revolution, we had republic, empire, absolute monarchy, constitutional monarchy, republic, empire, republic. All of that in one century.
So 1815 Napoleon, or 14 Napoleon's defenestrated, and he is replaced by Louis Philippe. First
First he's replaced by Louis XVIII.
Yeah.
So that's the restoration of the absolute monarchy. Then there is Charles X, so still the absolute monarchy, but massive crisis in legitimacy because, well,
this is all before 1830. In 12 years, there's 2 kings.
Yes.
Right.
So 1814,
it's like a soap opera.
Yes, it is. I don't know exactly when Charles X was crowned, and I should know that, but it is.
Fine, I don't know.
But by 1830, there is what is called les Trois Glorieuses, so the July monarchy. Charles X is kindly asked to leave. He goes in exile again. He is replaced on the throne by Louis Philippe, who was of the Bourbon d'Orléans family. So it switches from the La Famille de Bourbon, so the same family as Louis XVI, to his cousins, La Famille d'Orléans. And La Famille d'Orléans has been, well, trying to get to the throne since the 16th century. So it's been a long ongoing legitimacy crisis. So Louis Philippe accesses the throne in 1830, loses it in 1848. New coup, the Republic is installed.
All over Europe, there was...
Yes. Well, there was a wave...
Coincided with cholera, fun fact.
Yes, quite interestingly, yes. And Balzac plays on that connection between the cholera. I think he has the Polish refugees coming to Paris as one of the plot twists in Le Cousin Pons. So that's a sort of side note of outcomes of wars and pandemics in the 19th century. So Louis Philippe is deposed by a guy named Louis-Napoléon Bonaparte, who presented himself as first president of the Second Republic. He was president for a little more than 2 years and then said, "Hi guys, now it's an empire and I'm the emperor." So that's how France moved from the Second Republic to the Second Empire. And then there was, well, the debacle of Sedan 1870 with the invasion of the Prussian troops. So Prussia about to lead the German reunification through 1870, 1873 invades France, starting a long tradition all through the 20th century. And that marks the end of the Second Empire. For a very short time, people contemplated going back to a monarchy under Henri le Comte de Chambord. So he was known by the legitimists as Henri IV. Everyone agreed that he should be the one to take up the royalist authority, and he refused to come back from exile because he disagreed with the three-color flag. And that's another historical plot twist in France. And another history nugget is that things changed officially in France the moment an amendment was passed in the constitution. It's l'amendement Vallon, voted in 1870.
quoi?
L'amendement Vallon, of the name of the deputy who proposed it. And the purpose of this amendment was first to state that that France would have an elected president, elected by the majority of the two chambers, and secondly that no member of a former reigning family should take up the throne. And when this was voted, it was on a day.
I imagine that was very popular.
Well, it was voted in the parliament, and it won by one voice. And it so happens that one of the royalist deputies could not get to the assembly on time that day because he couldn't get a cab. So the course of history could have changed for a taxi ride in France.
Okay, do we have time for a few more?
It depends how.
It depends. What time is it? It's 5:25.
Well, we do have time for a couple of questions.
Okay, we'll go quickly. We'll jump around.
Right. Yeah.
Time periods, topic,
around. Yes.
books and authors. Returning to Girard, and the sort of application of both the descriptive mimetic theory and the normative return to Jesus. How might we apply Girard to the recent COVID-19 pandemic?
Oh, that's such a great question.
How might Marie
apply Girard? Well, one of the things that is often said now in the hindsight, mainly about lockdown policies, is that lockdowns by default were scapegoating the vulnerable, and it's one of the
scapegoating the vulnerable.
Yes.
And what?
Well, not the medically vulnerable, but using younger people and people who were called frontline workers as a buffer for avoiding the spread. So asking, for instance, young people to let go of their education or something extremely disrupting.
Their economic,
yes, exactly,
needs.
Economic welfare, etc., while at the same time relying on people who were largely from the working class to either fill in the shelves in supermarkets or do the driving or deliver meals. So yes. So on the surface, it looked like
scapegoating of the vulnerable. Yes. Okay, I hadn't heard about this.
So on the surface, it looked like everything was done to prevent the elderly and people with pre-existing medical conditions from being exposed. And that was the reason for the initial lockdown. The idea was that if everyone catches the virus, then the hospitals would be flooded, and there would be no way to make sure that those who are most in need of medical support would get it. So what was asked first as sort of, prevention measure in order to allow the hospitals to have the time to prepare was that everything should be halted for 3 weeks. But then it became just a standard policy. And then social distancing, etc., became the norm. So because of, in a way, what Girard would say is that the West has imbibed so much the idea that a victim is by default someone who should be protected by everyone. So that's sort of direct outcome of Christianity. Well, in the Roman world, for instance, if you're weak, and that's it. There's no way you'd have a social support network or the emperor caring for you in particular. So the radical idea of Christianity is that victims are sanctified because Christ was a victim. So during the pandemic, people who were likely to be at risk of medical things were singled out as being the potential victims, and everything was made in order to protect them, which happened by throwing other people under the bus. So largely working class people and young people. Well, we knew that young people were not as much at risk as older people. We knew that frontline workers were also likely to bring in any pathogens to their home, and it was considered a sort of lesser risk than just having a policy that would allow for personal risk assessment rather than having something standardized at the nation level. So Girard would say that first, the pandemic did create a movement of general panic, but also that the very idea of locking down was mimetic in a way. If you see, well, how things happened, China, then
Sure.
Italy,
Yeah.
but then France, because it was so close to Italy, and then Britain, as soon as France locked down, people in Britain, I'm not just talking about politicians, it was really the mainstream complaint, why aren't we locking down like the others? So I suppose mimetic desire there was extremely strong in the idea that we didn't really care if it was the right thing to do, but if other countries were doing it and we were not, then it meant that the politicians were making the wrong decision or putting economics before the welfare of their citizens. So, well, now we know in the hindsight that comparing countries that locked down at different periods or countries that didn't lock down at all, like Sweden, for instance, there are no significant differences in the additional deaths. So nowadays there is a sort of reckoning. Well, was it all worth it? But Girard would, I think, would really point a finger at the fact that the decisions that were made were largely irrational. There was some almost sort of magical thinking around many of the processes that were put in place.
And talk to me just a little bit more about the scapegoating of the vulnerable. I
Yes.
think this is quite interesting.
Yes.
A kind of conscious scapegoating, or I mean, I guess in Girard's formulation, the scapegoating itself isn't conscious. It's not that they decide in the Kala affair, the Dreyfus affair, we're going to make you a scapegoat. It is a natural. It naturally arises as a result of this. So, but talk to me about talk to me about this in the context of COVID.
Yes.
I'm quite
Well,
interested.
no one would have phrased that as all right, so we're going to have to scapegoat the students.
Yeah,
I think that the argument
or
was
the
or the
working
working
class
class.
people.
Yes, I think the argument that was put forward was that it was a painful but good decision. So it wasn't a sort of well, we don't care about you, but it was really a matter of
And how were the working class was scapegoated because they lost their jobs? Students were scapegoated because they lost their future
their education, yes,
and their education, their
and also well, their mental health, and well, we make a little lightly
developmental
of the
skills.
yes, we just say mental health as though it was just a matter of talking with someone, but well, I know personally some people who have suffered from it so much that it led to needing heavy medication to this day. So it's not just, well, a couple of hazy years.
No, it's for especially for adolescents, for everyone. We're
Yeah.
social animals.
And children who lost their well, formative years in terms of speech development. So one thing that
Facial recognition.
yes.
Yeah.
So all the things that a child develops between 6 months and 2 years. So being exposed to a larger circle, not just the immediate family, hearing different people speak, interact with other people than the immediate circle, all that was lost. And I think we'll only see the consequences of that in 10 years or so when these children end up being, well, of university age. And, well, yeah, in not so long, they will be functional adults and they will be the ones voting and making decisions. So the problem that was laid out then was that some lives were worthier of protection than others were worthier of development, which, well, it's an extremely complicated philosophical question. But right afterwards, and I think it's the debate that is going on now, either in Europe or the United States, about abortion or assisted suicide, that the vulnerable if they are unborn or if they are elderly, then it's totally fine to scapegoat them for economic reasons. So if you say, well, I cannot afford to have this child because I cannot financially provide, everyone will say, well, that's a good decision and go for it. No one would deny the fact that in the long term, a pregnancy will lead to the birth of a fully functional human being. But there's just that sense that, well, economics are more important. And when we see, well, people...
Well, that was not the case during COVID. It was the opposite.
Exactly. So
what explains that
I
sort
think
of
that-
flip in values?
I think what explains that is a very, well, how would I phrase that? A sort of utilitarian altruism perspective of just, I'm going to do something that looks good
But
right now.
actually, I'm sorry, Marie, that doesn't explain it, because well, maybe does the number of old, vulnerable people outweigh the number of young people in COVID, for example? From a utilitarian calculus, are there more young people than old?
Numbers in mind, but if you think of the mindset behind it, the idea is that, well, not enough houses. So perhaps if we, and it's, well, it's the aspect of the debate that is never put forward because we focus so much on the ethical side of things. But I think in hindsight, well, many people also think of themselves as being in a state of life where it might be better for them to die for others. So I'm not talking so much about the way state policies see people, but about how people see themselves in that mindset where if your life is not perfect on paper, then... well,
people say sacrifice for me.
Exactly. So the common point between the two would be that sacrificing oneself for the others is good. The problem is that when you have state incentives like that, so nudging towards...
to sacrifice yourself?
Yes. So stay home, save lives. That's a...
What saves lives?
Stay home, save lives.
Oh, yeah.
That was the typical British thing then. It's clearly calling for, you make the sacrifice of going out and you save lives. It's an extremely powerful statement. If you consider the way we talk about assisted suicide now, and how many people who consider that, well, they're reaching an age where life is difficult, it's not that easy, but if they died, maybe their grandchildren could benefit more than if a lot of money was spent in a care home. So even before they would reach a sort of critical stage of being terminally ill, they would consider, if I left now in dignity, maybe it would be better for my grandchildren than if we spent, I don't know how many £1,000 in a care home. So to your point that it's not the same thing, I think what it has in common is this idea that self-sacrifice is the key element that creates society. And on the paper, I'd say yes, absolutely, but not when it is state mandated, sort of a faith-based, Christ-inspired self-sacrifice that's quite beautiful. But when you have the state telling you, well, maybe now is not a bad time to kill yourself. It's that there's something extremely cynical about that.
Do you think that... Okay, this is a big question, but we'll
All the questions have been made.
They have, yeah. Well, I figured that I would try to at least disguise it in sheep's clothing or something by saying that. What were the sort of political objectives of Romanticism as a literary movement, and were those objectives met?
Oh, that might
specifically,
but if I put it
specifically around individualism and self-creation and such.
Right.
This is after, America has been created. This is 19th century movement, or post-American Revolution, post-French Revolution. We have this sort of long 19th century full of kind of rejection of Enlightenment ideals and focus on the individual and the beautiful life and the beautiful death and the self. This is a kind of like solipsism to some of it. What were the sort of political objectives of this?
Well, you're quite right to link romanticism and politics, because nowadays when we think
What were the objectives of Romanticism specifically, not about the states and state creation, but related to individual responsibility for individuals, not for states?
it would be hard to unify that, because romanticism was quite different whether you're talking of Germany, Britain, or France. What they have in common is the idea of a political system that allows for self-fulfillment. So we think of the Romantics as being these crazy long-haired poets walking on cliffs. In France, if you consider Victor Hugo, Lamartine, Chateaubriand, these were MPs. They were not just crazy guys writing poetry on a cliff. And their objective was that the political system around them would make room both for individual freedoms and for equality, which are two very antithetical claims. But that's what they were wishing for. That's what they were hoping politically. Now, if you look at another politician and romantic figure, Benjamin Constant, he's one of the political shapeshifters of that time. He was close to the Legitimists, moved towards constitutional monarchy, was still sort of a Republican for a while. So many of these writers do shift allegiances depending on what is going on around them and what they think might work at the time they are involved in politics. Does that?
It does. It does.
Yes. So romanticism would be equality and ultimate freedom.
Does it succeed?
No. Well, because these are antagonistic claims, and I think one author who foresaw that very well is Le Marquis de Sade. And there's that beautiful passage, Français, encore un effort si vous voulez être républicain, where he taunts the Republican ideal. Well, if you really want to be equal, then access to women should be the same for everyone. But we want to be equal for women too. So women too should have access to anybody they want. And therefore we should have state-based brothels so that people would not use their sexual pulsions in order to disrupt the state. And while we're at it, if we're just following the laws of nature, death happens in nature every time, so we should depenalize murder and just make everyone absolutely free to do everything they want. So in fact, the first person to have foreseen the absurd double claim of the Enlightenment, later taken up by the Romantics, of the fulfillment of the self through equality and liberty, is the Marquis de Sade, who makes quite good fun of it.
I think is Caroline Warman in the French department, she's written about the Marquis de Sade.
Yes.
Okay, I end all of these interviews with a more lighthearted, fun question.
Yeah.
Favorite book and favorite movie.
How many can I list?
There is no limit, Marie.
Right. Well, favorite book. I must confess that I'm currently listening to Gone with the Wind as an audiobook. I first read it when I was 12, and I just have the impression that Gone with the Wind is my politics. So, many things from the sort of contemplating the end of empires to frilly dresses, going through objecting to taxation. I think all of that is pretty much within my field. But the book I've read most often would probably not be that. I think, well, it's very hard to answer that off the top of one's head.
Usually I'm not asking a literary scholar.
Right. But the advantage of Gone with the Wind is that it also has a film going with it. I think the second part is probably less interesting than the first part. But I really like Paddington, the whole series. I think it's genius. And talking about other potential favorite books, Narnia, I think it's really up there. So, yes.
Well, Marie, thank you so much for coming on to the show.
Thank you for having me. It's been so pleasant. Thank you.